Okay, we're now being recorded. Thank you. And we can begin simply by noting that the main activities of this meeting today are to hear from our advisors who are working on public engagement, and in particular to ensure that the policies that are recommended in the climate plan and the way we go about developing those policies are consistent with the principles of inclusion and just transition. And I'm looking forward to that discussion and presentation. We're also going to discuss briefly a timeline for committee deliverables and the first draft of a template that would help us to structure the recommendations that the committee is going to make. We'll do those two things in the second half of the meeting, and the public engagement outreach discussion in the first half. Are there other topics that folks would we also will do something that I hope will become routine, which is to hear from our committee liaisons about what's going on in our companion committees of the Climate Council, and also quick updates on action steps that have been taken in between the committee meetings by our own task leaders. So those things everybody should have in mind would be a routine part of all of our meetings, even if they're very brief reports. We'd like to hear what's going on in the other committees and in our own task groups. Is there anything else that folks would like to put on the agenda for today's meeting? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. And I'll ask Jane if you are able to monitor people raising their hands to let me know. And I'll ask other people, if you have been patiently waiting to be called on, you're not called on, just try, speak out, because we can't see everybody's face on the screen at the same time. First item of business would be to approve the minutes that have been posted for the last meeting. And we do this in a in the sort of backwards manner of seeing whether anybody has something to add or an objection to the way the minutes were written. Otherwise, we assume that they are approved by consensus. Everybody okay with that? I think they're fine also. All right, thanks. Well, let's consider that the minutes are approved. Jane, do you know whether Catherine's going to be with us, right? Is she on the call yet? She's not going to be?
She's not planning to join today.
Okay, thank you. So first up is a presentation and then discussion with representatives from RISE and Climate Awareness, who are on tap to assist the Commission with the really important and challenging work of public engagement, outreach, inclusion, and just transition. And I'm expecting just to turn the floor over to them. Can you please introduce yourselves and help us understand what ideas you've got for us?
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Richard. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarika Tandon. I'm the principal of RISE Consulting, where we consult at the intersection of race, equity, and environmental issues. And I'm here in partnership with Climate Access, who's bringing deep expertise in building support for climate solutions through innovative engagement projects and strategic consulting services. And I'll be co-presenting with Meredith Herr today, who's the Deputy Director of Climate Access. And together with Kara Pike, also from Climate Access, we're developing and implementing the public outreach for the Global Warming Solutions Act's Climate Action Plan. And I just want to give a brief overview of what we'll be doing today. We want to share a little bit about the approach that we're taking to the engagement. And Meredith will then walk us through the activities and timeline, which will include various touch points with the subcommittees. And then we're going to have a discussion. This is the most important part where we hear from everyone in the group about who we want to be in conversation with and include in our engagement process so that we get all the critical perspectives. So a little bit about our approach to start. So we're working at this from the point of view of co-creation, which means a collaborative approach to innovation, design, and implementation. So we're co-creating with the Climate Council via a partnership with the Consensus Building Institute, co-creating with you and all of the subcommittees through a collaborative design and multiple touch points throughout the process. And of course, really importantly, with the Vermont public. So when we think about co-creation with communities, we are trying to create a process that invites community members in and supports their ability to contribute to assessing risks and opportunities and determining strategies to prioritize. And one of the great benefits of taking a co-creation approach here is that we're building buy-in by creating a plan that reflects the priorities of the community and involving the public in the process versus coming up with ideas and then trying to get people to buy into something after it's fully baked. And we are working to implement equitable engagement strategies, and that looks like engaging communities with respect, accessibility, and reciprocity, paying attention to communities that face disproportionate climate impacts, including community expertise from BIPOC, low income, youth, LGBTQ+ communities, people with disabilities, and other communities that are often underrepresented in climate adaptation and mitigation processes. We'll be offering underrepresented community members stipends for their time and participation. And just in general, wanting to be responsive to the community and give adequate lead times when we're making requests of the public. Another aspect of our approach is to offer multiple pathways for engagement. And this includes storytelling, visual communications, community events and deliberative dialogues, and stakeholder surveys, polling, and interviews. And so what we're doing here is supporting people in engaging and contributing to prioritization and decision-making and offering those multiple entry points, because no one of these will work for everybody. So if we're diversifying the options for tapping in, then we're maximizing opportunities for people to inform the process. And then the last aspect is going at the right place, which is just allowing time for outreach and input to avoid a process that only involves the usual suspects, people who've been engaged already, and avoiding harm to relationships with communities that have been historically underrepresented and are critical to engage. And conversely, creating positive working relationships so that when we come to implementation, that there can be partnership there. Providing adequate time for the community input to inform the draft, and avoiding checkbox community engagement, which is more sometimes the tokenizing or more for the sake of appearance, but actually trying to create a more authentic input and engagement.
Thanks, Sarika. So I'll walk through our timeline a bit before we get into the discussion, which is really the core part that we want to talk with you about today. And it's nice to see a number of familiar faces now, having been on a few calls. So some of this may be familiar to some of you, but we've been working through the timeline and thinking about the different points of public engagement, but then also the different points of engagement with the subcommittees, where we'll be sharing with you and also listening help from you as well for the different pieces. So the first phase, and this is the phase that we're in now with these calls with you, is that we're designing a process to identify and connect with target audiences. So we're going to be interviewing, after we identify stakeholders with all of you, we're going to be identifying a group of folks to interview. So we'll have an interviewee list that we'll put together, and we'll talk with folks about what they're wanting to see and how they can best be involved in the process and engage, how we can better involve the public in the process. And we'll also be hosting 2 different roundtables. So one of those online roundtables will be focused specifically on BIPOC community leaders, and the other one with community members more generally. And then after getting all of these great ideas from our interviews and the roundtables, we'll be putting together a summary, and we'll also share that with the subcommittee members as well. Let's see. Oh, not advancing. There we go. So the next step is really around the pre-draft input, and this is where we're developing the public engagement plan, and we'll also have points where we interact with the subcommittees for that piece as well, making sure that we're really connecting on that plan development. We'll be putting together a social media campaign and outreach materials, a whole collateral packet for that piece, and then leading the public engagement launch around before the draft. We'll be creating an online survey so we can really get additional public feedback, a whole website content strategy, making sure that language on the site is put together, and then a series of stakeholder dialogues where we'll be talking with folks again. And then we'll also be working with community organizations too to provide that partner support during the process. And then we'll be, for the draft plan outreach period, starting in the beginning of December, we'll have that draft climate action plan comment period promotion that we'll be assisting with the comms and outreach for, more partner support with community organizations. And then we'll be developing a really cool online deliberation and voting platform. We're working with a firm called Othello, and they have some great online tools where we'll be able to actually put out pieces of the draft plan for folks to vote on and interact with through a really nice interactive online tool. So that'll be a nice way to gauge additional feedback. And then we have the final plan rollout, release of the final plan. We'll have involvement with the subcommittees as well on how to reach out for that final plan piece. We'll have help facilitate press conference and public events, and also provide additional partner support. And then the final piece of the whole project is evaluation. So we have an evaluation process that we use to go back through and see what worked best, or maybe things that weren't as effective, so that you can continue to improve these processes moving forward. So I'm going to stop my share there because we really, kind of the meat of today is we want to really hear from you. You know, as experts in this work, and really talk about the stakeholders that should be involved in this process. And then just to let you know that from these meetings, we're meeting with all the different subcommittees, and we're going to be putting together a spreadsheet with all the stakeholder groups and individuals that get mentioned, organized together, organized by those that are specific to subcommittees, or folks that would be good to reach out to more generally, in order to make sure that we really coordinate those outreach efforts. So yeah, we have a few questions that we can ask. The first one's really about the stakeholders in general that need to be involved in your subcommittee work, and what do you hope to gain from that engagement? And I think the best way to do this that we've done with other subcommittees is to kind of use a popcorn style, where I'll turn it over to someone and then you can pass it on to someone else from there. So I'll paste this question in the chat, but again, it was just what stakeholders need to be involved in your subcommittee work, and what do you hope to gain from that engagement? Let me see. I'm actually gonna bother Jared, because I think you were involved in our other subcommittee meeting, so you may have already put some thought to this. But I guess related to this subcommittee, are there any other additional stakeholders? And then if you could pass it to someone else.
Meredith, may I interject? Sorry, I'm late, everybody. Peter Walk, I'm the DEC commissioner and the co-chair. I have some concern that we could pop popcorn for the next 6 hours with potential stakeholders to be engaged here. And I'm not entirely clear that that's going to be our best use. It's our work is so broad in its outreach and its reach that there are a lot. happy to do it. I just want to be aware of that we're going to skim the surface with a limited popcorn effort.
Peter, thank you for that. And I agree with what Peter just said. I think we could begin a process here, but it might be better to challenge each of us to submit names to you in writing. You know, after this briefer conversation today. And I share Peter's concern that this committee has to deal with so many different issue areas that the list of folks that we would want to see engaged in the process is going to be very long.
I definitely hear that. One way to have a briefer conversation right now is to focus maybe on sectors or industries if we want to kind of be more general in our discussion rather than getting down to the nitty-gritty of names. If there are specific organizations or coalitions that you'd want to flag, that might be a way to be more brief. I'm seeing a hand maybe from Gina.
I have a basic process question before we get into who we're talking about here. We're going along from a technical point of view and from the point of view of the same olds, developing recommendations. But in my view, we have to intersect with you all at key times along the way. And I can't figure out from what you just described how that's going to occur. I mean, that's really holding me back right now in transportation is I don't want to say too much because I need to know how and when we're going to interact with the greater public. So do you guys have ideas about that? Because in my view, it's a major roadblock to us making any progress. And I don't see our process going on and your process going on is two separate things. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I think one idea of trying to be coordinated is that we know that the public can get overwhelmed if there's too many touch points. So just wanting to make sure that we're coordinated with all the subcommittees so that that messaging can be as streamlined as possible. And also with the CEP process, kind of bringing all those moving parts together as we reach out to the public. So I think there's going to be times where it makes sense for subcommittee members to do that outreach. And then maybe there's other points where it makes sense to roll it up into the broader outreach, our communications process as we develop the social media campaign and the, the website materials and those kind of bigger, more general pieces of kind of language that we're putting out for CAP in particular. So I think the idea was to really make sure that we're not stepping on toes and we're working with your, acknowledging your existing work. Am I understanding your question correctly, Gina?
Well, I need more knowing how we're going to interact. Can we help develop questions? Can we participate in the meetings? Can we listen? And when are we going to do that? Are we going to do that next week? Or are we going to do it in 3 weeks? Or are we going to do it in 3 months? Those kinds of things. I mean, and the rest of you speak up. Maybe I'm the only one that's caught up with, I can't put my pen to paper on this. I can't start doing analysis until I know when and how and what we're going to interact with the public.
So I'm going to just let me
Thanks,
just call on some people because there's a lot of interest in this topic, and I have my own questions, which I'll chime in on later. I had Christine, Liz, and Jane with their hands up. Christine, you're mute.
All right. I think it's great that this work is being done. Thank you very much. I have a couple of little bit more context questions just so I can better place your work and where it attaches to the pretty complex architecture that's in place with the Climate Council. So, and that may start to help get into the conversation that Gina was asking about. Are you primarily working for the Vermont Climate Council? Is your point of contact Jane? Are we just one are the subcommittees, and this subcommittee specifically, one subset of multiple different organizational entities that you're engaging with within the architecture of the Vermont Climate Council.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, we're contracted to work specifically on climate action plan, and Jane is our I would say our lead contact for that piece. So we're also really wanting to make sure that we're coordinating with the CEP process as well, and then to bring in, you know, all of the subcommittee work also. But we are at Climate Access and RISE, we're contracted to work specifically on climate action plan.
And can you explain briefly the intersection of what you will be doing and what CBI will be doing, just so I can understand that, please?
Jane might be the better person to talk about that.
Yes, so CBI is contracted specifically for facilitation. They do have in their contract time to facilitate public engagement. And we haven't actually sort of dug into how necessary they're going to be with supporting the work that's led by Climate Access and RISE, but they're really in service to support Climate Access and RISE's leadership on the engagement and outreach components of the work, and they're really the inward-facing facilitator for all of us, our work. But they do have capacity within their contract to help with that. And maybe while I have the floor, I'll just make one or 2 points in response to Gina still. So Gina, I do just want to suggest that one of the things I was hearing you suggest is still this chicken and egg around like how deep to go in like crafting strategies and recommendations without having that initial feedback, and how is that going to work, like that co-creation, both, you know, with the Climate Council, the contractors, and then with the subcommittees and the people who are really in charge of actually drafting the strategies and recommendations. And I'd actually be interested to get into that a little bit now, but one of the things that we've talked a lot about, and we'll talk later on in today's agenda about, is a new timeline based on when we're going to have that information back from Climate Access and RISE, and how you'll be able to receive that synthesized engagement from the audience analysis, interviews, and roundtables, and then what that then means for the next phase of engagement around broader engagement on draft strategies and recommendations. So we're going to talk about that today. But one thing that I haven't actually had a lot of conversations with these guys about is the actual role of myself, the role of subcommittees, the role of counselors in the actual roundtables and interview. I mean, I think the interviews and audience analysis are led by Climate Access and RISE, but it'd be interesting to hear what, if any, role there is in the actual roundtables for participants, because actually I haven't thought to ask that yet. So that would be an interesting touch point. And then I imagine what we're doing today will happen again at the end of June, where we'll have a substantive conversation about what we heard from Vermonters through this first phase of engagement.
So I've got Liz and then Joey.
Yeah, I'll cede my time to Joey. It's about co-development. We can talk about it later when we hit the timeline, but I agree with Gina that it's a big focus and we need to get more specific. So Joey.
Thank you. And apologies if I'm not very cogent. I had my second Moderna vaccine yesterday and it's throwing me for a loop. My question relates to Gina's, because we're in the transportation conversation together, and just more broadly, which it would be very helpful, I think, to understand more how you plan to sort of set the stage and frame it out, because I appreciate the co-creation component. And at the same time, some of these strategies are like bread and butter, like weatherization and, you know, I mean, sort of transportation demand management strategies. I'm just curious how, you know, as Gina indicated in our transportation conversations, we're sort of like at we're stymied a little bit because we have some of these buckets of things that we know we're going to need to do. So if you guys can share a little bit more about how in those different segments of engagement, how you're thinking about sort of how you're framing it out and how you're starting from, you know, where we're at in this moment in terms of work that has been done before, but also the strategies that we are highly likely to employ, and the how we employ them is really, I think, what I think is we're going to answer in this big part of the co-creation process. So I'm just curious about that.
So I'll chime into the list of questions before we call on you to respond to all of the above. I too am questioning how the outreach that you're planning to conduct would, on the one hand, be informed by the subcommittee members and the subcommittee, initial ideas that we've been working on. Because, of course, how you ask the question will go a long way to figuring out, whether you're getting really good responses and well-informed responses from members of the public. And you can ask the question in different ways and get totally different responses. That's on the sort of what would be called the framing side of it. Similarly, on the listening side of it, I think many members of the subcommittee would be interested to make sure that we are able to participate in public engagement activities as active listeners, and as opposed to hiring folks to go out and talk to the public and come back and tell us what the public said. So can you add those two comments to, the list of questions we've just put to you?
Yeah, were there any remaining questions, or I can jump in on these?
Good.
Yeah,
Kelly?
go ahead, Kelly.
Kelly, I see your hand up.
Yes. Can you guys hear me now? Good. Okay. One more thing is there are a whole bunch of small business organizations, for example, since I'm supposed to be representing small businesses on the council, and I'd be happy to reach out to them, but I'd love to have tools that I could use. So I didn't know if you could also, as part of this, be providing us with something where we could do some outreach on our own and not, have to squeeze our particular groups into this very, lovely package but there's not a whole lot of room for every single group under the sun. So yeah, one more question for you guys.
Meredith, if I could quickly just sum up, I think where the tension you're feeling is and why we have struggled as a group to sort of establish our own clear deadlines and process is because we're the sort of rubber meets the road in terms of specific policy recommendations. And it feels uncomfortable for us to be talking about co-creation and talking about public input, where at the same time we're being asked to develop specific, recommendations that are already not fully baked, but partially baked or more baked than others in some ways. And that's that uncomfortable tension that I feel like is underlying a lot of the questions that we're getting. And we're going to talk some about that from a internal process standpoint, but if you're hearing that lack of comfort, that's where that's coming from in a lot of instances.
Thanks, that's helpful context, and I really appreciate you sharing these concerns. Obviously we want this process to be as effective as possible, and we're still kind of a bit of a learning curve of coming in and just getting all of the pieces figured out with the different subcommittees and how this all comes together. So it's really helpful to hear. And I think in terms of the question around, working with the public and how we're framing that from the outset, our co-creation process is starting really to hear first from the public. And so the interviews and the roundtables, we don't want someone to necessarily feel like they're representing an entire sector. Obviously that can get problematic, even, specifically thinking about the BIPOC community as well, but really wanting to hear from leaders who can speak from a number of different kind of stakeholder audiences of what they're feeling in terms of risks from climate impacts or from fossil fuel industry, really hearing from them first without folks having a menu of options kind of in front of them that they're responding to. So that's kind of, and that may feel like a step back maybe from some of the work that you're doing, but really wanting to first hear from the public to really make sure that folks are engaged at the outset of the process, rather than jumping in with something that's partially baked that folks are responding to. So that's our process that we've used with a lot of different cities that we've found effective, is really kind of creating a bit of a stakeholder baseline. And that was the idea of the discussion today. And also, you know, we can take it offline and work through, you know, putting those lists together if that's more effective than in a dialogue format, but really trying to hear from you about who those people are, you know, who those stakeholder groups are more broadly in the sectors, or actual specific leaders who you think should be in the room for an interview or for a roundtable, who could provide some of that input on what those issues are that are most important for folks from those different communities. So it's really a listening process at the outset. And then further along in the process, you know, there's a question about framing and outreach and tools. We are definitely developing those, and that will be, you know, with your feedback. We can put together, you know, those the script for the interview or for the roundtable can be shared in advance. We can get, you know, happy to get feedback on those pieces, and also on the survey language before that goes out. So as much as folks want to be engaged with those different touch points, I think we're happy to obviously want to be transparent about all of those pieces. So when we have those materials, that can be shared out, and we can work with Jan on how that would work in terms of logistics and process. But, you know, definitely don't want to be at something where it's a surprise, where we've gone out with something and you're unaware of it. That's not our plan or what we want to see happen. So, you know, all of those materials could be shared in advance for feedback. In terms of active listening for the roundtables, that I need to, I think, have a conversation about. I can check with our executive director, Kara, too, about some of the logistics on that in terms of how many folks we might be able to have in the roundtables as listeners rather than as public participants. You know, it's a little different now with COVID. You know, when we've done this process with in Boston and in Louisville, they were in-person dialogues where, you know, there was city staff involved or state level staff involved in those, you know, as listeners in the room. So I imagine we could have that be part of the online process as well, but that's just something I don't necessarily want to speak out of turn about. So I think, I don't know if I missed anything. Sarika, is there anything you want to chime in?
Yeah, so the phase that we're at right now is discovery. And there's two layers to that. There's finding missing voices and perspectives. It may be coming later in the process that you would like, but better to get those perspectives in now than to not bring them in, because that eliminates some of the surprises later. But the other point of this audience analysis summary that we're hoping to have done, hopefully by the end of June, is so that it can help target communications. And so that we're analyzing the different perspectives and the different ways we need to be talking to people so that this plan can be implemented at some point. And so to Chris's point in the chat is that we're at the outset of public engagement, but the council and subcommittee work has been going on for months. And so we're just recognizing that tension, but I still think that there will be a value add in making sure we're hearing from as many voices as possible. And so the purpose of this meeting, and I appreciate and respect the curiosity about how the processes fit together, but is really to hear from you all, just as we'll be hearing from each of the other subcommittees, so that when we do bring people to this initial table for the audience analysis, that that you can also influence who shows up there. And again, if it's not the most effective thing to have this as a dialogue, if you want to do that digitally, we can do that. But we do have 3 or 4 other questions that we wanted to ask you specific to that process, because we're hoping to start putting that together in the next week or so. But I want to pause there and just make sure that we've at least addressed all of the questions that surfaced.
Rich, if I could just hop in quick, Sarika, thank you for that. I think there is some value in a digital process. I think one thing that I'm a little uncomfortable with is that we have you know, a lot of us do this work on a daily basis. It's not just a council activity. And so we have a lot of our sort of usual suspects sort of stakeholders, and that's not meeting the mark. And so I'm a little bit worried that just based on our own knowledge of who we think the stakeholders are, that we'll miss that. And I'm wondering how some of that list will get broadened.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's a great point. So we are not going to be able to include everyone suggests into the process. So we'll be running it through multiple filters and lenses, including, you know, a technical or sector-based perspective, regional diversity, sort of other kinds of demographic diversity. And we will be vetting our final list with Just Transition Subcommittee so that the equity lens is one of the primary. I really appreciate you naming the usual suspects. And the other thing I'll say about that is many of the usual suspects are on the council and the subcommittees. Your perspectives are very much shaping this process already. And so the public engagement process is to bring in other perspectives from the community. Yeah. Meredith, do you have anything you want to add there?
No, I think that's right. I'm really focusing on that equity component.
So I've got a question about your intent. I have two questions for you. One is, can you provide us with a report or an example of a process that you've gone through that influences, you know, you in figuring out how you would do this in Vermont? You mentioned a couple of other jurisdictions where this kind of thing has gone on and you've done it, and it would be great for us to be able to see, oh, this is what they did in, what did you say, Boston? This is what we did in this other place. And that's the kind of structure that we are envisioning. I think that might help us to understand how we can help you, you know, to do this collaboratively. The question that immediately comes to my mind is, you've mentioned 2 or 3 different means of engagement with the public. And I'm wondering, is there going to be an attempt to make it a statistically sensible cross-section of the state? Or is that, you know, statistical inclusion not really part of the way you go about doing this?
I think we want to make sure that we're including folks in different geographies, and that, you know, our goal is to really look across groups that are underrepresented. And so looking, you know, for folks who can speak to the LGBTQ experience, who maybe are coming from low-income communities, who are part of the BIPOC community. So looking for folks who are engaged, who can speak to those different stakeholder communities. And as much as we can, you know, find those folks through recommendations through the subcommittee, and also, you know, Sarika is working with us as well to identify those individuals. But we can definitely, in terms of our past work, we can definitely share some of those examples. I'm happy to, you know, obviously we've tailored this process specifically to your context. So it's a little different, you know, when we work with different governments, but happy to share that offline.
So I take it from your answer that, and I appreciate and support completely the idea of reaching out to communities that are typically underrepresented in efforts like this. But your answer seems, you seem to have said, and I'm just checking with you, that the goal of the work that you envision is to reach out to particular communities and members of the public who are typically not so present in these discussions, as opposed to trying to get a cross-section of Vermont, of the Vermont public, that would somehow represent the entire body politic.
I think that we're trying to do both. And when we talk about underrepresented communities, there's another layer there. These are communities that have differential and disproportionate vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, and often a differential access to some of the mitigation measures and other things that we use to combat climate change. And also, many of them tend to be the least contributors. And this is all based on data and science. So what we're trying to do is correct for underrepresentation, but we're also talking about disproportionate impacts.
Of course.
But we're not doing it. It doesn't have to be an either or. There's not an opposition between focusing on or communities that are most at risk and also bringing in other voices. And I think that's why we're coming to the subcommittees, because we know that we have a lot of names and ideas around communities that are most at risk. But we also want to hear from the subcommittees to make sure that it's well-rounded and that we're not missing any perspectives from any of those points of view, including, as you refer to, the body politic.
Thanks. By the way, I want to be clear that, speaking for myself, and I think for the whole subcommittee, that we are really interested in making sure that we meet the objectives you just, referred to. So, but I'm really just trying to figure out whether at the end of the public engagement process, we will be able to have a sense of what a very broad, cross-section of Vermonters would like to see us do. And if
this
that's
is where
not,
I think our between these initial interviews and roundtables, and then when we get into the survey work and being able to the more broadly we can distribute that survey, the greater cross section of folks we'll be able to hear from, and also through our online community deliberation tool. I can share the link to the firm that has done that in other communities too, so it might be good. You can pop into that website and see how Othello has done that work with other communities around these types of processes. But those are, these interviews and roundtables are really the initial touch point with a smaller group of leaders and stakeholders. But when we get into to that pre-draft stage, it's going to be a much broader outreach through the survey, through additional stakeholder dialogues, and then that online deliberation tool really has the ability and opportunity to reach out much more broadly and have folks responding, directly to a number of different issue areas and policy options through that tool. And so I think that's where we'll get a much bigger kind of chunk of the broader public as well.
Thanks. Other questions or comments at this point?
I'll just add quickly, Richard, that I'm grateful for this effort. It's and the challenge and questions you're hearing from us are not related to a lack of support for this process. I think we're all just trying to figure out how do we manage all of this work and do it effectively, and realizing how nice it would be to have, from a timeline perspective, to have this already in hand, right? The output of that first phase of public interaction be in hand, and that's not a reflection on you, that's a reflection on the work and the timeline that we've had to do this, and just grateful for your help because we need it.
Well, the idea is to get a bunch of this moving as soon as possible, so we can work with Jane and put together the best process for folks to weigh in on some of these stakeholder pieces, either over email or if there's a shared document that we can create that folks can participate in. So we can think through that process and get back to the subcommittee in terms of the most efficient way to weigh in on this stakeholder piece. And then we can move that forward and make sure that you're involved in that, at the different stages.
further discussion on this part of the work. I really look forward to engaging with you folks on each step of the way. I think the committee's questions are revealing that we want to help, we want to figure out how to make it as productive as possible.
Great, thanks. And I'm seeing a lot of good stuff coming into the chat that I haven't been able to respond to, but I'll go ahead and save that, and we can always follow up on an email too.
Liz? and
Yeah,
Jane.
I
Jane?
do have something, if you don't mind, Rich. I apologize. I'm reading the summary of how you're going to put the plan together and listening to what's said. I think my concrete question, maybe for Jane, is as the very initial outreach occurs, will this subcommittee have the chance to provide what I would call, or maybe Gina or someone else already said, informational material, framing material, something to educate and to provide context for that outreach? Or is it done instead without that context? I just really concretely want to understand which of those two it is, if possible. And I hope it's the first.
We have talked a little bit about this, and my understanding is it's more the latter, but I hope Meredith and Sarika can talk to that a little bit.
I think when the initial contract was set up, the main touch point was really just solely with the Just Transition Subcommittee. That was kind of the primary, reading through the RFP, and that was kind of the initial idea, was Just Transitions was going to be our primary touch point. And as we learned more about the process, then we realized that it's important to make sure that all the different subcommittees were involved as well, to a varying degree. I think Just Transitions still, it's my understanding, is kind of remains our primary subcommittee connection, but that's something we can think about.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I get that part, and I just want to make sure we use our time efficiently. My question is more not about the connection between you and the subcommittees, but more what material, if any, will be going out to the public in that very initial engagement that you do, with or without the rest of us participating or watching or involved. Will there be context setting, educational, informational material, and data from a subcommittee provided, or not? Or is it done literally blank slate?
The interviews and roundtables are really set up as listening. So there's no presentation piece that we're providing. It really is a listening session. So there'll be an interview guide, and also, the roundtable is similar, where it's facilitated discussion, but it's really just to elicit feedback from those participants. We won't be presenting any, framed work or anything in that way. There's no outreach materials for that piece.
So
I imagine there'd be a 1 to 2 paragraph email describing the context of Global Warming Solutions Act and what part of the process we're asking people into.
So it's asking people to show up with whatever knowledge they happen to have, and just to answer some questions about global warming, or about the ideas?
About specifically their concern about the risks that they're facing in their communities, their relationship to different mitigation and adaptation solutions. And so thinking through, how do they perceive climate change in their day-to-day life or in their work? So really thinking broadly about their experience as a Vermonter and their connection with the issue.
So I'm familiar with various practices for stakeholder engagement, including deliberative polling. And the experience with deliberative polling has been that when you gather people to initially tell you what they think, they will come in with their opinions about things and they'll tell you what they are. And then if you present people with good information about the subject matter, and including debatable points, different points of view presented to them with information about the subject matter. Typically people learn from that and say, oh, now that I understand something I didn't know before, my opinion has changed. And it sounds to me like the process that you're sketching out right now is just, setting the background, as I think you referred to it as, I forget the term, sort of the blank slate. What is your experience? What do you think about certain broad brush topics? And that's a decision made by the Just Transitions Committee not to present information as part of these roundtables, at least in the initial frame. Is that right?
That was a decision that was made, I would suggest collectively as we put the RFP out. I wouldn't say that sat anywhere with Just Transitions, but I also think that, there is a real challenge in front of us around the framing of the issues, as well as just the timeline and what kind of feedback you want. I feel very supportive of the approach that we're outlining here, but I'd be curious now to test what everybody's feeling about how Meredith just described it. And because it's not just about the mitigation components, then it's also about the work of the ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, and the framing could be quite, it could be a lot of work if we wanted to truly go out and sort of frame all of the issues of the act that we're working on right now.
And I just want to make a clarifying point that at the beginning, again, this is a discovery phase. We're trying to understand the audience and what their concerns are. We're not asking them to prioritize strategies or tell us how we should solve it, but to be aware of what the community defines as their concerns and vulnerabilities around climate change, so that we can let that inform the plan development, but also inform the communication strategies that come out of our public engagement plan. So the deliberative polling happens much later in the process, and the question of framing, we will address that quite a bit later.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Christine?
I found the statement that you just made very clear and helpful, that this is the discovery process, and what you want as a result of this phase of the work is what are the concerns and vulnerabilities about climate change of a broad range of stakeholders, presumably ones who aren't already engaged. You didn't say this, but I'm assuming presumably among stakeholders who are not already typically and currently known to be engaged in the conversation. To me, that's a discrete assignment. I can understand what the end result, I don't know what the content will be, but I can understand what the end result would be, and therefore how we could use that in the processes that we already have undergoing. So if that's really what this conversation boils down to, I have a much better understanding now, and thank you very much.
So I think we have a lot to talk about in terms of our own timing and in work within this. We do have the sort of latter part of the second half of our meeting is specifically designed around that discussion. And I think we should take some of these things that we're holding on to from this conversation and bring it to that so that we can really chart our own path, knowing now what we know about this work.
This is Chris. If I could make a comment here.
Please.
So I would just add that, there are comments in there about, there's a lot of information that's already known. There's a lot of science and data that's already out there, and that's absolutely true. But a big part of the point of this process is a lot of the data that's been presented, a lot of the solutions that have been recommended, a lot of the plans that have been developed have frankly been developed by communities of privilege, those of us participating in this discussion right now. And so the point of having the public outreach and engagement, some of that stuff might actually be challenged. And some of the positions and policies that have been suggested, some of the things that we've just accepted as this is the way things are, this is the way it should be. Part of the point is to engage with the public to say, reflect on that. How does this sit with you? How does this affect your community? How does this affect your friends and neighbors, the people that you interact with most? Does this, do you have all the information you need? Do you need additional information? Is there information we're missing? Are there other policy approaches? And that's a big point, that we're trying to get to through this public engagement process. I know it's coming on the back end, but we need to challenge that assumption that a lot of everything is already known as far as kind of like what the final approach should be. So, it is awkward, right? Because ideally, the public engagement process would have begun, even as we were forming the council, frankly.
Right. It should have been last year. Right.
Yeah. So, but we're catching up, and so this is we keep talking about the analogy of we're building the airplane as we're flying it, or whatever you want to say. So nothing's wrong. It's just we're not we're not necessarily baking the cake or flying the plane or whatever or analogy we want to use in necessarily the sequence that would have been ideal. But we're gonna get there. It's just gonna take some time and thought to get there.
Something about the schedule for this. Are we going to be talking about that later, Peter? Because I would really like to have the input from these early listening sessions as soon as we can get it.
Yeah, and I think that's we all agree that this sort of upsetting the known universe to reflect what lots of different people know is exactly what we need. And we're also still cognizant of the kind of the broader tasks we've been given from the council as a whole to develop ideas on a certain timeline to be able to produce a climate action plan. And I think that's fundamentally where the tension is, that we need to find a way to make sure that this input that we're getting from the process that you're leading is not token, for lack of a better word, that it's not coming too late in the process to inform our development process. And that is what concerns me.
I'll add another question to Meredith and Sarika. Is part of your process something where you, over time, stay in touch with the folks who have participated in a roundtable or in a listening session and go back to the same people to ask them for their input on different ideas that are being evolved through the council process? Or is it one and done after you've done a listening session or a roundtable?
I think ideally that we're connecting with folks who are already engaged on this issue to some extent and who are leaders in their own communities. So I think having that continued relationship with folks who have been part of this process as we move forward to make sure that they can help, as we say, distribute the survey or to get folks in their communities to be part of that online deliberation process as well. So really seeing those people as, becoming invested in this process and helping us, reach then broader cross sections of the public, through their own community networks. So I think, really seeing them as key folks who can help us, with that broader outreach as we move through the different components. And so that's a great point.
Anything further from any of the members of the Subcommittee. We may be, I think we're just about on schedule. I'd like to hear from members of the public if there are any comments from the public participants in this meeting on this part of our agenda.
This is a reminder, you do have the ability to raise your hand, and if you don't have that feature or you're struggling with it, please just come off mute and we'll go from there. It looks like George and then Annette and Steve.
I go first?
George, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Look for the opportunity to speak. I can understand you're trying to handle this very multifaceted problem. I've been trying to figure out how I would tackle it. I think the suggestion I might offer is to consider use cases for each of the different stakeholders you might think of, and you would probably put them all in a pot. Every stakeholder group is going to have a different vantage point, obviously, and you probably want to, before you walk in the room with them, have some leading questions to develop for each one. One that I'm, as a planning commissioner, aware of local to our communities, there's frankly, there's going to be a large part of the public that does not embrace climate change as an issue. Many of them are of lesser means and don't have any spare income with which to participate in a climate action plan. It's like electric vehicles are not part of their plan. Weatherizing is probably a great investment, but they don't have the capital to do that. They're simply treading water to stay where they are. Probably at least a third, perhaps 40% of our households in this community and others around us are that background. And I'm concerned that that community is going to be feeling pretty disenfranchised with any of the things that are brought forward as solutions. So I think a major issue is the social economic equity, and that cuts across both racial and regional divides. I mean, there's probably other communities like ours sprinkled throughout the rural parts of Vermont in Northeast Kingdom as well. And so I think that's a big challenge. And I think when you think about this problem area, that one is one I would really give extra thought and energy about and preparing for. Thank you.
Thanks. I think Peter named Steve and then Annette.
Annette first and then Steve, based on the way hands went up.
Okay, Annette first. And then
Good afternoon. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I've been listening to your conversation. I'm challenged to offer any suggestions. It's still very abstract. You have made a couple of comments about taking things offline to get more specific. So I don't know what that means. I just would offer to be happy to be interviewed by these folks to help bring my perspective to it. I deal with a lot of people who are in no way interested in getting involved in some of the issues you're dealing with, but those issues come to them. And so I can share that perspective. And I want to agree with what George just said, that we have, I think, pretty clearly got two Vermonts going on right now. I mean, I am right now overwhelmed dealing with an issue in my town, which is opening up most of our public roads to ATVs. I have learned about tremendous abuse of the environment with not only ATVs, but Jeeps going all over private property on Dorset Mountain, on Woodlawn Mountain, people using roads without right-of-ways. These folks are not tuned into climate change. And it's apparently a growing problem. And I just use that as an example to say that there is a whole segment of our population in Vermont now that is very detached from this whole conversation. And they're really not interested. I mean, tonight at my select board, we are looking at a proposal to open up almost all our public roads to ATVs. Those are all gasoline powered. They are all very noisy. And none of those folks care about electric ATVs. So I throw that out there to say that part of this outreach, if you want buy-in from people who are not on the same channel that you folks are, that's a whole challenging aspect. But I think reaching out to ATV clubs, to snowmobile clubs, to loggers, to people who are invested in the internal combustion engine might be something to look at in terms of groups. I think that's about all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Steve?
Thanks. I think I'm probably going to echo a lot of what Annette has just said. As a teacher, I have to love the cognitive disequilibrium I'm seeing on the screen here right now, looking at a whole new way of looking at things. But I guess something that I see about this whole process is that dealing with climate change is something that really has to engage everyone, not just creating a plan, but actually, the next 20, 30 years, everybody has a role here. And it means all the people Annette just listed. It means people who don't have a clue yet, for whom this is sort of outside their day-to-day necessities, and they're just not aware. But I think what strikes to me is the need. I get, and at the same time you have the planet having its own time frame, and we can't ignore that. Right? The planet is on fire, as some people are saying, literally and figuratively. So we have to kind of do both. We have to figure out how to engage everyone and at the same time act quickly. So it almost seems like there are two tracks, and you've already, you guys on this subcommittee know about lots of those no regrets solutions that have to be done, and that we need to get rolling on quickly. But at the same time, this blue sky approach, reaching out to the broad spectrum of the population, seems also to be really important. So I think you probably find things that you never expected will be coming up. There may be some great ideas. There may be some ideas that come up that help you recast how we approach things, as opposed to exactly what we come up with, but how we approach them. So yeah, I guess I would urge that, putting it in the frame of what you accomplished by December, that A, real solid shorter term solutions, and B, what's really the start of a very long process, which is engaging the full population of Vermonters. So thank you.
Anything further for this discussion? Okay, I think we're scheduled to take a 15-minute break until 30 minutes after the hour. Peter, anything further from you? Or ready for a break?
No, thank you all. This has been a great conversation. Obviously, that's the beginning of this conversation, and lots of good discussion we had. And we will see you all at 12:30.
Yeah, thanks everybody. But it's a thorny one, and I really appreciated everybody's thoughtful comments.
Really appreciate you all coming in and helping us with this and think through it. And I know we have hard questions. I think developing a way to provide more concrete input to you in terms of stakeholders would be a good process, and we'll discuss that as we spend some more time with it this afternoon, later on this afternoon.
Okay, we're on a 15-minute break. We'll be back at half after the hour. Jane, will you pause the recording during the break?
That's like beyond my skill level, I think.
Okay.
Let me see.
So
I normally just let it run.
It'll just run. Okay.
I'll try that.
All right. See you in a few minutes.
Oh, I see it. I know how to pause. I'm pausing.
Excellent.
So I'll have two videos, but oh well.
I'd say
We're resuming recording.
we're now
Okay.
recording. Chris, you're up.
Yes, I just want to just share a brief anecdote about along the lines of what we were just talking about. And so what we were, just to be clear, we're not talking about like alternative facts, alternative science, alternative experience. But I grew up in coal country in southwestern Virginia, which was also tobacco country. Two industries that changed and are changing drastically. And the difference is, I'll use coal for example. So there's a difference if you live in a coal community to be told that jobs are going away and they've been going away for decades, and flooding is going to get bad, and you're living the climate change existence with the frequency of flooding and the loss of homes and communities. There's a difference between being told that and being engaged in a way where you sit down with people and you have the conversation about what is your experience with job loss in your communities? What's your experience with job loss in your families? What's your perspective on what's driving that job loss? What's your perspective on flooding in your communities? Have you had any personal experience with that? With people being displaced? Let them see the data, ask questions about the data to people who know how to interpret it, and where the data came from and how it's been collected. It's not that you're necessarily gonna come up with 100% agreement on paths forward or what the issues are or how they should be interpreted, but at least you're meeting people where they are, and you're giving them an opportunity to engage and process, and share their own lived experience. And what the research shows is they tend to, it gives you a greater chance of people kind of, building on that experience to arrive at and offer suggestions for solutions that work for them. And so that's the difference is, if you just take the data and you tell people, these are the facts and this is what you should believe and this is what you should do, that's a different approach than saying, let's talk about your experience. Does your experience bear out these facts that we're presenting to you? What do you think we should do about that? What's the best approach? What do you need to adapt to this situation? Because that can then help inform the policy situation. So on the public engagement side, that's what I think we're talking about, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Chris. Any comments on that? Yeah, I mean, I think that's great the way you framed it. And I would only, reinforce that by saying that means that we need to make sure that the process is more than just blank slate listening and now we go away. That, we can't, so that's one of the things that emerged, I think, from our prior hour of conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate where everybody's come in on this conversation. It's been really helpful. I think it is aligning that process of public engagement that really is deliberate and thoughtful with the tasks that we have in front of us, and making sure that input informs our work in a meaningful way, and that people actually come out at the end of it feeling heard and feeling like they've been engaged. Because I worry that they're a little bit in parallel and not interrelated at this point. And so that's what we need to figure out if we can make better. With that, we have a limited period of time to do both liaison and task lead updates. So let's get into it. Let's start with Chad and the rural resilience.
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to be looking at the notes from last Friday's meeting. Yeah, I mean, I think we went through sort of, we discussed how to tee up the why regarding resilience. So why do we need to be resilient? And how do we connect this to people. So very similar to the discussion we've been having this morning. Previously here, we talked about consultant needs for the municipal vulnerability assessment. And then we talked about some future agendas. We're going to have some folks from science and data join in a couple of weeks, some additional folks from GMP, in addition to Mike Burke, who's serving on the subcommittee. And we're going to talk to some folks from the state of Maine who are involved in the development of the Maine Can't Wait Climate Action Plan. I guess that's basically about it. And then, we're going to have some public engagement folks on the agenda this week as well, or I guess tomorrow. So again, very similar to the discussion we've been having here regarding the importance of public engagement and outreach. So I've appreciated this conversation in particular. I think that's about it, Peter. Jane, I don't know if there's anything that I may have missed that sort of, jumped out at you on Friday.
Thanks, Chad. I was just going to add in the chat, but I'll say out loud instead. I was just going to comment that those folks are coming in specifically to have a focused conversation around vulnerability indices and what other states have done, as well as what we currently have for tools in Vermont. And the likelihood is that after that meeting, we'll move forward with either an RFP, a grant, or contract on that component of the work for the climate action plan.
Great. Let's transition to Lauren in Ag and Ecosystems.
Thanks, Peter. I guess we have 5 different task conversations going on right now. One of which is development of the carbon budget, which is kind of on hold until we get our technical consultants on board. So the other 4 are actively having conversations about strategy development and are kind of each developing, at least from my perspective, I'm on 2 of the 4, developing that starting list of different partner organizations, coalitions, community networks, et cetera, that we'd want to be reaching out to. So kind of what we were just talking about in the first session today here, which hopefully will inform our meeting tomorrow with RISE and Climate Access, since they're coming to our meeting as well. Strategy development is underway, and collaboration between the task conversations is happening kind of at the elevated full subcommittee level, so we're not being redundant, but also not missing anything. I assume as those strategies get fleshed out more, there will be a need for more concentrated and intentional efforts across subcommittee, especially for those actions that would have implications on the work, for example, of this subcommittee or any of the other 3. So I think that's probably it, but I'll also, like Chad, say, Jane, if I missed anything, please jump in.
All right, thanks. Kelly and Chris?
Kelly, you want to go first?
Sure, and you'll let me know if I missed anything, because I did have to miss a few meetings. So just transitions, we wanted to get a bunch of principles and things and tools for everyone faster than we've been able to, but we've had some really good discussion around it, and I think we're going to have a better product by making sure that we didn't rush it. So on the agenda for this evening is to hopefully approve our draft or sort of preliminary guiding principles that the other committees can use. And we're going to hopefully make some real headway on getting some guidance around the most impacted or frontline communities that we need to be considering as we make policies. So those are both in the works and getting really close. The principles are the closest, and hopefully you'll have them very soon. And then those frontline communities, we had some good preliminary discussion last week, and I'm hoping we get really far on them tonight, because I think that'll be really useful as well for the work of this committee going forward. Chris, anything I missed?
No, I think that was great. One thing I'll just note when everybody sees the draft, and Kelly, tell me if you agree or disagree with this, but we've been operating not in a bubble, but just like all the subcommittees, we've been working amongst ourselves. and kind of bringing one another along to understanding what, there are a lot of terms and issues and concepts that we're talking about. And I think one of the things when you see the draft principles is communicating not only to what extent you agree with them, but also to the extent that they are plain English enough and understandable to where the concepts and the reasoning behind the concepts are understood. Because yeah, if you've been doing that kind of work and all for a while, it may be language and terms and concepts that you're familiar with, but if not, it may. So anyways, I just think that'll be important for their, not only their usability, but yeah, just so they're even usable. Yeah. Jane?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because yeah, if there's any feedback that's like, we don't understand this, or this is not helpful, it's too vague, the idea is that this is useful and it doesn't just get shoved off to the side and covered with dust. So yeah, thank you, Chris. That's a really good point.
I was just going to add that there's also been another process that I participated in earlier this week around taking the principles, which are very lofty, hard to like sort of bring down to like actionable items, and transition those into a set of questions that would lead to the equity assessment. And Lauren put in the chat, Judy's joining us from Ag and Ecosystems, Judy Dowd, this evening to sort of share some questions that Ag and Ecosystems has vetted and thought about a little bit from her perspective. But then we also had a really just great Jamboard session the other night, taking the principles across the top and then trying to say how would you ask a question of this principle for the strategies and recommendations that come forward. And I really think that's a really great body of work. All of the work coming out of Just Transitions right now is really great. So it's exciting to see it then be handed off to the other subcommittees in the next week or so for feedback. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Kelly, Chris, and Jane, and Jared.
Thanks, Peter. So we had a science and data subcommittee meeting yesterday. I think Jane is the other person on this meeting who attended that. So Jane, please add anything. The first part of it, we were focused on kind of trying to work towards finalizing our work plan. I want to thank, I don't know if Ryan Patch is on the call, but thank Ryan for his feedback on the draft work plan that I sent out to, I believe, everybody on this subcommittee and the agency staff that are also engaged. There's still time if you have feedback, we'd like to hear it. I would say that overall, a lot of the pieces of our work plan interface closely with kind of engagement with and review of draft products from the technical consultant. And so that's great that that process is moving forward. I imagine Jane may share an update there. And, but one of the first things we're really looking at is the existing inventory, greenhouse gas emissions inventory methodology, and some of the questions that are emerging around both that and additional ways that we can understand our emissions from, questions about life cycle accounting for energy emissions, et cetera. Had a really helpful overview from Colin Smythe at the Department of Environmental Conservation, who's the lead author of the state's greenhouse gas emissions inventory. I'll defer to Peter to talk more about that, but it was really helpful to have that presentation and be able to engage in some discussion and ask some questions of Colin. So I think that's it. Just again, if there's any comments or questions about that work plan, please let me or TJ and Leslie and the co-chairs of the committee know. But I think it aligns well, just from my perspective, with a lot of the goals and intentions of this committee. I think we're in a good spot to be supportive of the type of analysis that some of the analysis that we'll all be looking for in terms of assessing pathways and economic and health and other types of analysis that need to be done both on kind of business as usual and on possible solution pathways.
Yeah, I'll just add one, the science and data is shifting to an every other week meeting, just So folks, as you're monitoring the meetings, they'll be doing longer meetings every other Wednesday now. For the immediate term, recognizing that as consultants come on board, we'll likely have to go back to every week so that we're not a bottleneck in collaboration with them. I'll also just use the space to provide a quick update on the RFP, if that's helpful. So the RFP closed last Monday for the technical analysis support of the climate action plan. Thank you endlessly to Christine and Jared and others who really put a lot of time and effort into helping us review and rank those proposals. We had 4 solid, amazing proposals, all of which could have done the job, which is really great, and also could have done the job on our timeline, varying in cost based on that, but really great work. And we have a leader, and I think it's fair to say that the highest ranked proposal was Cadmus, and we're working with Cadmus, who's also partnering with EFG and UVM to put together the team of consultants to work, and they're also looking at broadening their team to get some more expertise at our urging with respect to some components like the carbon budget. And so we've asked them some guided questions to consider within their scope of work and their cost proposal. And their intention is to have that a revised redlined scope of work and cost of proposal back to us by the end of day tomorrow. So our hope is that we'll be able to move forward with contracting them in the next week to 2 weeks. And so but if for some reason it doesn't work out, as I said, we have 4 strong proposals. Happy to share those if anybody else wants to see or just understand what we got with respect to the substantive work that was put forward. But it's a really, I think we're really excited about working with Cadmus and EFG and UVM. So I hope it will pan out. So thank you again for that.
All right, thanks, Jane. Next up are reports from our task leads. We have just a few minutes for that, so I hope you can just give us a quick update. Joey, can we start with you?
Sure, and I can be brief and Gina can weigh in because I'm so out of it. But we have been convening with a group of players that, include a couple of regional planning commissions and Clean Cities Coalition and others. Just, we have sort of the list of the different strategies that are likely to be on the table. And as we articulated earlier, I think Gina did a good job of sort of articulating how we're sort of waiting to apply the principles coming from just transition and sort of waiting for the public engagement process to sort of vet those. We did sort of start to go through the draft principles, and we're looking forward, Kelly and Chris, to the final principles that are going to come out of just transitions. We just thought it would be a helpful exercise to sort of, even knowing that they're still draft, to sort of walk through those concepts and apply it to like things we know are likely to be on the table, like transit expansion and stuff like that. We didn't get very far because we know they're still draft, but anyway, sort of an ongoing conversation. And Gina, if you have anything further to add, we're really looking forward to taking it a pretty significant stride further when the consultants come on board and the public engagement work gets underway.
Yeah, I think the thing that we really have to reckon with is understanding the investment that's necessary to achieve the emissions goals and our part of the emissions goals. And I've got my fingers crossed that the technical group is going to have the transportation expertise necessary to help us figure that out. I mean, at the same time, calculating the costs and the benefits of that investment. So that's kind of the big picture challenge right now with our list. And we really look towards the technical folks to do that. I was wondering, Jane, if the technical group has their transportation, their sector expertise, has that been evaluated in any way in the process of selection and in recommending what else they might do? And maybe I'm getting off topic here, and it's just a question around, I mean, this is what the transportation group is dealing with. in a big picture way? And are we wrong to assume that we're going to get that help from the consultants or not?
Nope, not wrong to assume. And yes, they have sector expertise with respect to the 4 areas here articulated in their proposal. And so hopefully, Joey, I shared it with you and Joey yesterday, so please do look at it and let us know if you have any feedback on that specifically, but it's articulated in the proposal.
Yeah, I've got some concerns, but I'll talk to you offline about that. Yeah, so we're really lucky. We've got a group of people. We meet once a week and talk about the various issues and challenges that we're up against. And we are making from those deliberations, we're getting good information. Got to agree with Joey. So that's it for now.
All right, thank you, guys.
Rich, is it okay? There's one thing I neglected to mention. It's on the topic of science and data, although I don't know if it's coming out of the science and data subcommittee, but just a brief update, because I know that the task leads that are looking at some of the policy options and kind of prioritizing kind of initial frameworks may be interested in this. And that is that now that the state's greenhouse gas emissions inventory has been released, EAN has updated our emissions reduction pathways analysis with those new numbers through 2018 and including the revised numbers for the baseline numbers. So I will share that revised pathways analysis out with this subcommittee and with the science and data subcommittee. So that is available for you all to use. Again, let me know if you have any questions about it. And I'll also just, while I have the floor, note, I think this is relevant both from a science and data perspective and potentially from a resource to assist with public engagement. We are planning, EAN is planning to release our annual progress report for Vermont on emissions, energy, equity, and the economy on likely either Tuesday, May 25th or May 26th. So there will be a lot of updated information and analysis in there that should hopefully be helpful to many members of this subcommittee. Feel free to reach out if you want to request copies, presentations, discussions, those type of things. But so the 2 resources coming your way soon in the updated emissions reduction pathways analysis and the updated annual progress report for Vermont.
Thanks, Jared. I did drop the link to the updated emissions inventory in the chat for folks to look at, and it has the updated information about the transition in modeling approaches for the transportation sector if folks would like to dig into it. And I can also set folks up with Colin if they have questions.
Okay, thanks. Should people be told about, in a very broad sense, about the change having to do with how transportation is?
Sure, I'll do it in a couple minutes. We have used over the course of time 2 different modeling approaches to estimating transportation emissions. The one we initially used from sort of 2017, looking back at 2007, looking back at the data to 1990 up until 2011 was a fuel sales based EPA model. EPA then developed what's called the MOVES model, which takes state VMT estimates and applies it to known data about the makeup of the vehicle fleet, and then is able to provide some pretty precise data or estimates about the way emissions are occurring within the transportation sector as a whole and sort of in the individual buckets. As Colin was digging into that data, that gets released on every 3-year cycle. So that's part of our data lag. And in the intervening years, we will look at our VMT estimates that we provided and make sort of trajectory adjustments to what we think is happening in the intervening years. The challenge with the data that was released for 2017 from the EPA from the MOVES model was that VMT went up and the emissions went down to 5% one way, 7% the other. I can't remember which one it is. and there wasn't enough about the efficiency of the fleet for it to account for the emissions reductions. And we probed into the system, and we asked questions of people at EPA and didn't feel comfortable with where that discrepancy was coming from. And so we returned to the other EPA model that is based on fuel sales. That model is a model that that other states around us use. Massachusetts, Maine, all use it. New Hampshire uses a similar fuel based model. So it's consistent, and it's actually what the IPCC recommends. We liked the MOVES model because of the fact that it had such individual breakdown of the various subsectors of transportation. But if we didn't have faith that it was producing reliable results, then we needed to go to a different way of estimating. But again, all of the greenhouse gas inventory are based on estimates and models because we don't have sensors around the state picking up emissions. We don't have individual sensors on vehicles. So it's all a modeling exercise. And as we all know, all models are wrong, some models are useful. And so we keep that approach in mind as we go forward.
Thanks, Peter. So just to boil that down, I understand that by changing what we're looking at in the model from an estimate based on vehicle miles traveled and assumptions about the fleet mix, we're now looking at emissions based on gallons sold, and that you're comfortable with that, with basing the transportation emissions calculations on gallons sold in Vermont. I assume there's a border adjustment of some kind.
Yeah, we could have Colin go into how the actual tool works.
It's okay. I found it really interesting that there was such a difference between the emissions estimates based on the one hand from VMT and based, compared with actual gallons sold.
Yeah, and Gina can probably speak a little bit. I don't see Dan Dutcher on here to how some of those estimates are come up with. They're very estimate-y. But I think with the bigger piece that I would say is that this is the sort of perfect opportunity for the science and data and the consultants that come on board to provide input to our review to determine whether one of these two is better or a different way altogether is the appropriate way to count emissions from the transportation sector. That's the expertise we're looking for.
Yeah, I'll just say that VTrans calculates VMT. They do not run MOVES model. And so you have to run it yourself, or EPA does it. And there's comfort to me knowing that these other states are using the purchase data. My concern is that there's a lot of through traffic that buys gasoline in Vermont, and hopefully you've calculated. I'd like to hear more from Colin on how that's been calculated, not just at the border, but all that truck traffic. Well, it's not there anymore, but the border crossings were up at least prior to COVID hugely, and those people are buying gasoline in Vermont, and Vermonters are buying gasoline outside of Vermont. It's the very nature of the beast. So as long as you can calculate that in somehow.
So I think it would probably be useful to have Colin join your task to discuss.
Yeah, our group would love to. I'd love to hear more, and Dan maybe can help facilitate that. He's very involved in those conversations, so that would be useful for me anyway.
All right, thanks, guys. David Farnsworth can't be with us today. Christine, do you have anything to report from the buildings task?
Yeah, Dave and I met yesterday by phone, and my role the last week or so was really focused on reviewing the proposals. So I'll be completely honest about that. That's where my focus was. Dave, I know, has been continuing to stay engaged with the Clean Heat Standard EAN team, and I believe has been engaging on the transportation on our subgroup here. So I know that he's doing a lot of continued thinking about the various draft early stage policy programmatic ideas that we shared at the last meeting of this group, and is continuing to refine his thinking about some of the details of those, but we also didn't want to get ahead of the process. So I'd say it's ongoing, and we're looking forward to seeing the template, and that I think we're going to be shown today, and I assume we'll be asked to fill it out at some point. And if that's the case, I think we'll be ready to go when the time is needed.
Thanks, Christine. Liz?
Yeah, Ed isn't able to join us, I don't believe, but I can be really short. We've discussed next steps. We have a stakeholder list, but bluntly, we haven't advanced that since our meeting on the 29th, beyond some of the meetings we've had with one another and the other folks at the department about what they're doing on the CEP. So we're more up to speed on those points of intersection, but we have not yet moved on to the next important phase, which is talking with folks both on this subcommittee and externally that are, obviously involved in those policies.
Thanks. Anything from you, Peter?
Just an update that I've been really pleased with the work that one of the tasks of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee has been doing in terms of looking at various emissions possibilities from the agricultural sector. And they've really put together a nice overview of what, the various on-farm measures that could be taken and how those would affect emissions. It's a lot of good data and modeling work that exists outside of the state and can be brought to bear. I would say the challenging piece is that the current tool the EPA tool used to estimate agriculture emissions in Vermont is really blunt. It's essentially a number of cows times a emissions factor sort of calculation. And we know that the way in which cows are fed and the way in which they live and all of those things has an impact, and how the way in which manure is managed. So trying to figure out how do we claim Vermont's uniqueness in that subset is important, and trying to understand that. So there's good work happening there. We've had good conversations in the industrial and space, as well as looking at kind of laying out per your direction the last time, thinking about sort of, okay, if we wanted to increase the digester capacity at wastewater treatment plants to meet those emissions, what would that look like and what would it cost, so we can have that as part of the bucket discussion. Other than that, things are progressing, and looking forward to the timeline conversation with all of you.
Thanks, Peter. In fact, the calendar of deliverables is the next topic on our agenda, and you're up.
This is going to be a tag team, I think between Jane and me, as we've been trying to sort of figure this out. As you heard, as part of the conversation we had earlier about public engagement, there is a lot of sort of who's going first in this process. The Climate Council meeting, what was that, a week? And I can't remember when the steering committee meeting. Too many meetings, was this week, and the question was asked about whether or not we could have initial policy recommendations ready by July. Was kind of the thought process. That I think that there's questions to me about how that interacts with the public engagement process, and how do we adjust and grow that body of knowledge with that outreach. But that was the original thought. And then, so Jane and I have been thinking about sort of what do our steps look like to get to that. We had originally talked about having policy recommendations by May. We've had some conversations already over the last month where we've got some of the ideas out there. Jane and Catherine from CBI have put together a template for entering those in, and that we, with as much information as we have at this point. And then it's really thinking about sort of what is our internal process for deliberation around those recommendations? Do we want to, how, you know, sort of the council as a whole is doing consensus-based work. Do we feel we need to reach consensus on putting together an initial list? Or are we going to be reliant on our or our task leads for that process? That's kind of an open conversation. And then how do we want to build our calendar between now and, let's say, the middle of June, when we would kind of need to be starting to wrap up some of that work? So Jane's put together a little bit of a rough timeline and work product based on our meeting cycle that may be helpful for us to go through and talk that through. So with that, Jane, can you share?
Yeah. Yes. I thought perhaps I might share the slide that was presented to the steering committee on Monday first to ensure all subcommittee members have seen this now. So, and then I'll move to the.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Hold on.
We can see that.
Great. Okay, so I feel like I want to show this as often as possible, largely because it seems like such a silly, simple graphic, but I actually can't tell you how many folks helped sort of synthesize in a simplistic manner the timeline in order to present it to the steering committee on Monday. But this all stems from the conversation that started at the Climate Council meeting, and I shouldn't say started at the Climate Council meeting, but sort of came to a head at the Climate Council meeting in April around what will we know and how will we be able to present the comprehensive climate action plan for December 1st. And so what I've with the understanding and knowledge from all of you, this is my way of trying to illustrate to you sort of the key touch points along the way, and then hopefully be able to build out from this the subcommittee milestones that you all need to hit in order for us to stay on track. What this does try to also illustrate is the touch points with the public engagement and technical analysis. And it also tries to acknowledge that that while there are these intentional public engagement phases now with the contractors on board, that we really have been doing public engagement in some capacity since the onset and passing of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and predating that to sort of get it passed in the first place. So I do just want to recognize the value that these meetings having public comment, the web form that as we hire, we're in the final interviews this afternoon of hiring a Global Warming Solutions Act coordinator. We'll be able to actually really digest and use that public comment with all of you, but we are getting a lot of feedback and comment on the public input form on the web. And then also we were intentional, as Climate Access and RISE touched on today, in bringing on diversity in order to reach more Vermonters in our selection of subcommittee membership. So that's really great. And I just want to acknowledge that work has been ongoing and will continue and outlive the December 1st deliverable of the Climate Action Plan. So you heard from the contractors this morning around the public engagement touch points. I will just highlight that really I'm not sure if they spoke to this enough in great detail, but this initial phase 1 will be done in the next 6 weeks or so in order to have it synthesized and presented back out to subcommittees by the end of June. And so that July date of actually having that full package and suite of strategies and recommendations for it to go out to the public on phase 2, we'll have that initial framing and knowledge shared back with you. So when we move into this very rough spreadsheet that I put together, thinking about planning out your next few meetings, there will be a space for you all to take in that public engagement and hopefully process and think about your strategies as a result of what you're hearing from Vermonters. And so I also just want to acknowledge that the technical analysis, we're really excited, as I mentioned earlier, to have it on board and going forward. But the reality is, no matter how we slice or dice this, the fall is just going to be really an intense time with respect to regrouping around the strategies and recommendations to incorporate the feedback from that phase over the summer, as well as only just starting to receive the economic analysis in September, with likely not full economic analysis until October. And then also recognizing that while you're trying to package all of that together for your final set of strategies and recommendations, you're also going to really have to be thinking about what this slide doesn't show, but what I'll try to show in the spreadsheet is how you move to be thinking about the proposed rules for A&R to adopt, as well as other strategies with respect to engaging the legislature next year. So I'm going to take this down, but before I do, does anybody have any questions about this slide? Oh, Chris, I see your hand.
Hey, Jane, just a heads up, a pattern that I'm detecting almost across the board is lots of people going on vacation, seeing family, doing things post-vaccination, July and August. I don't think we can change our schedule, but it may get challenging just having even Quora potentially. I just wanted to raise that because I'm hearing that, you know, with commissions, town select boards, all kinds of other groups. So just a heads up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you for calling attention to that. So yes, we have discussed that. Really, it'll be around, we'll have a substantive period of time for that engagement, a few months, and hopefully as a result, we'll be able to get as many folks as we can over that period of time. You all were also covering the right side of my graphic, so I do just want to draw attention to the distinction here being that the Climate Action Plan, as adopted by the Council in December, will not have been vetted as a complete climate action plan by the public. So that final phase of engagement that we discussed earlier today around that deliberative polling and processing will come after December based on the schedule that we have here. And so we're really sort of thinking about this as I think we have to, as an iterative process, that it'll be a complete climate action plan, but that we're going to always be, you know, working to improve upon it. And that includes that touch point of that final engagement that will happen in the winter.
Jane, should I assume on the way that graphic is put together that the activities on the different streams underneath the months at the top are the same?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Great, thanks, Jane. That's helpful. Does anybody have questions about that time? I know it's still not a like Gantt chart for how these things are going to roll out or whatever. So it's you know, different people work at different levels of specificity. Just making sure people are comfortable with what Jane presented.
Yeah, well, it also doesn't specify, and I think at some point we will need to get more specific about making the links between the streams, you know, the technical stream, the public outreach stream, and the policy deliberation stream. At some point, we're going to need to have touch points across them, you know, links up and down, and those aren't specified there. You know, we haven't invented them yet, the schedule for them, but at some point we're going to need to say, okay, here's where we take something from the top line and put it into the public engagement line or into the technical analysis line. And here's how it comes back, and adjustments can be made.
And Jane, this is also, we're also thinking about that sort of top line of activity, or the sort of the July to August development of ideas. That's really that's the sort of council level. And so we're in a sort of input prior to that, if that makes sense. It
does. I mean, I have not tested this with the steering committee yet of the Climate Council, but just in recognition of the timeline, I have spoken to other leadership folks around and I think that this will be on the topic for the next steering committee meeting and or council meeting around how much engagement the Climate Council itself wants to have on the suite of strategies that we put forward for this initial phase 2 of engagement over the summer. But the way that we are thinking about it now is that those will come from the subcommittees, and that there won't be time essentially to have the council then do some sort of prioritization prior to putting those out to the public. It will really be the subcommittees that batch up their strategies and recommendations with some tools that I'll speak to as we go through this spreadsheet, and we'll test the broad range of what subcommittees are putting forward over the summer without having done that prioritization first. And I suspect that's how it will happen.
Thanks.
So what I've done here, and Joey, Peter, Richard, myself, and Catherine met earlier this week, and this is the starting point of sort of like a recognition that this work group is this subcommittee, I should say, rather, doesn't have a work plan per se, and of course there's been a chicken and egg around understanding timelines and milestones, and it's been somewhat of a moving target. But as that gets nailed down, specifically the first concrete milestone, which is the putting together of the full package of strategies to go out to public engagement on over the summer, it seems that at some level there needs to be a deliverables, tasks, and milestones for you all to understand the different touch points up along the way to sort of build up that package. And so what I tried to do here really simply, and this is rough, so that you can all start to remember and understand the tasks and milestones in front of you. It feels like it might be nice to understand what those are and start to sketch out the next few meetings in order to understand how you're coming to a cumulative package for July. And so I'll just sort of run through this briefly, and then this is, again, just a rough draft, and I'd love to have discussion on if something like this is useful, or how we can, if it is, how we can inform doing something like this a little better and differently. And this is all me, so of course I could also work with CBI to think about this too. So, again, one of the things that we spoke about, and understandably you guys have not focused on yet as a group, you've sort of dove into the idea of pulling together strategies and recommendations. There still needs at some point to be a comprehensive inventory of existing programs and strategies that work to mitigate greenhouse gases. And so I'll just go through these first, and then I'll propose ideas. But some of that work's been done as a sort of building of knowledge and expertise at the beginning of the Climate Council meetings. And so there is a starting point, but at some point, someone's going to have to own that, and it'll likely be an iterative process throughout the way in order to add to it and make it comprehensive. I think that a task and milestone all along the way will be the feedback that your group will be providing to contractual needs around the technical analysis component. And there are some imminent needs that are pertain to that coming up, and one of which I put on an upcoming meeting. There's the phase 1 public engagement, which really speaks to like what you just heard and the feedback that you'll still continue to provide the consultants around shaping the stakeholders and the interviews. But then there is also a timeline to ensure that that synthesized engagement comes back to all of you in a useful way so that it can inform your strategy development. This is the meat of what you're all working on, the identification and analysis of, it says new strategies, but I imagine you're thinking about existing strategies too, to enhance, and programs, and thinking about ultimately then running those through an equity impact assessment. There's the phase 2 engagement. There's the actual incorporation of the feedback from that public engagement. And then there'll be the need to consider the cost effectiveness with respect to considering the economic data that we get from our technical analysis. So this comes later, right? But I'm just leaving it here along the column so you think about the final suite of tasks that you need to be considering. there's the prioritization of your strategies and recommendations that will go a long way based on that cost effectiveness, as well as the public feedback. And then there's the presentation and summation of the total package from this subcommittee. And then there's still, which feels like, I feel like just getting to that point will take to December, but then there's the actual ideas of developing and evaluating the financing strategies, the rules and legislation. And then later on in the fall, there'll be a consistent touch point with this subcommittee around the monitoring and assessment framework that the technical analysis consultants are developing. But we'll want to really be thinking about how your policies and strategies all feed into that, so that we have an ability to track the progress on the ground in real time. The final recommendations, and then really thinking about how we move into the phase 3 of public engagement. So that's sort of like at a very high level, the main tasks associated with the work. And it has felt like to Peter and I, as we've talked about it, not knowing if this is useful to folks or not, but perhaps starting to sketch out. And what I have here is just the next 4 meetings, which is, that's all there is, 4 meetings till we get to July 8th. If we keep this schedule, and thinking about what the main components are to get to that phase 2 of public engagement that is needed by all the task leads to ensure that we have a deliverable for July. So I'll pause there, and then if it's helpful, I'm happy to just sort of frame out some of the obvious ones that I saw.
Thanks, Jane. I think the obvious question is, do we need to adjust our meeting schedule to provide additional time for consultation? And underlying that question is really what level of stamp of approval do we want to put on the series of recommendations that go towards that phase 2 public engagement?
Yeah, I think that's a question for all of you. I'll comment that the way I have it here, it gives you in June 10th and then June 24th for each of the 2 task leads, like you have done in the past, to present the full suite of strategies and recommendations. And then it gives you 1 more meeting after you will have heard from the public engagement to come back and sort of have all 4 of the task leads have to sort of identify any revisions made based on that public engagement, just so the subcommittee is on board. But that would mean at July 8th, you would be sort of approving your full package. And I'll just comment on one of the things to get you to that full package is obviously the template that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. But then there's also the idea that that I've been thinking about after talking to Catherine a bit about this, Morris, that it would be nice if I worked with the consultants to put together a slide deck that would be sort of like a template. In New York, they actually have sort of skipped the idea of an Excel spreadsheet template and moved right to using PowerPoint as the tool that in that state advisory committees input their strategies and recommendations into, that it's funneling into a cohesive package that gets presented to the Climate Council. But in this case, I feel strongly that we should have an Excel tool to complement it as well, because I think it will help feed into the writing and crafting of the climate action plan.
Thanks, Jade.
Can I ask a question about the difference between phase 1 public engagement and phase 2 public engagement?
Yep. The phase 1 is what you were providing input on today, which is the framing of the issues. And the phase 2 is actually when they begin to implement their public engagement plan, which they're working on now while they're doing the phase 1 engagement also. And it's really around testing those strategies and recommendations that come out of subcommittees. So it's more reactive.
So phase 1 is right, more of the listening initial, like they called it outreach and getting feedback, but it's really input. And phase 2 would be taking programmatic ideas to the public and getting feedback on it? And would the same consulting firm be doing, or the same two, is it RISE and the Climate Access that would be doing phase 2, or is CBI doing that?
RISE and Climate Access is managing all public engagement and outreach all the way through phase 4, which they didn't really talk about today, but that will be sort of the ongoing outreach and engagement materials that will they'll develop for us sort of after next spring as the climate action plan is begun to implement.
So I just want to make sure I understand the challenge to all of us and to the task leads here, that we have essentially 1 month to develop our suite of strategies and recommendations. And during that month, RISE and Climate Access will be out listening to people. And they're going to report back to us 2 weeks later after we've developed our strategies. Is that what I'm seeing? Phase 1 public engagement presented at the June 24. When we are tasked with coming up with our strategies, at least these would be our, recognizing that they're draft, provisional, subject to review, et cetera, but we've got a month to fill out a bunch of templates and develop a suite of strategies according to this schedule.
Yep, 2 lucky task leads have 6 weeks. You guys will have to pull straws for that.
I have a related question at some point.
Okay, questions or comments by folks?
Christine, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. And is it not a statement of fact that the policies, programs, initiatives, strategies, whatever you want to call them, that the task leads are developing as draft provisional are intended to be one form of input to the technical consultants, who will also be doing their own research, analysis, modeling, et cetera, and potentially changing, finding new, or further enhancing the sort of higher level direction we've provided to them to help guide their work. Is that not true?
That's very true. So yeah.
Okay. So I think we need to be careful about the messaging here then.
Yeah.
Because it's not, I don't think it's a statement of fact that once a task lead has deemed by June 10th or June 24th, that's the list. That's before any analysis has been done on emission reductions, before any analysis has been done on cost effectiveness, before any analysis has been done on economic impacts. So would it be perhaps a more accurate statement to say, what are the policies, programs, initiatives, strategies, whatever the language we're using, what are they that we would like the consultants to consider as they begin to do their work, and to advise us moving forward on the continued best list, starting with what we did in June. But I would hope that's going to change. Why are we going to do all this analysis by them if it's not going to change?
So I guess to clarify what I was saying, Christine, is that when we as our cross-sector subcommittee put forward a list of ideas, regardless of whether it's preliminary or final, that has our, the stamp of our effort on it. And we have all not been involved in each of the individuals or policy level discussions. Having worked with many consultants in the past, I can imagine that they are going to provide us with guidance on cost effectiveness of various things we put forward, but I'm not sure that they're going to wholesale give us new policy ideas to consider. That seems to me like that it would likely be outside of the scope of what we would be anticipating. And I'm not sure that it meets with the intent of the council, frankly, at that point, right? That it's not a council derived activity.
I would like to use our terms carefully. And are we talking about pathways? Because that's relatively easy to come up with. But if we're talking about the details of a program or policy, that's going to take a very long time, and should take a very long time. So really, we're talking about pathways, which is an approach, incentivizing the purchase of electric vehicles, let's say. It's a very gigantic bucket. And I'm comfortable with
to me
that.
that's beyond a pathway, Gina. That's a strategy, right? That's
well, okay. The pathway.
Pathways.
Tell me what the pathway is. Get more EVs on the road.
Yes.
Okay. Is that what we're talking about, Jane? Or are we talking about how we would structure an EV incentive program?
I don't think we're talking about how to structure the incentive program,
Okay.
but I do think, I do think we're talking about the strategy that you mentioned above and not the pathway when Peter just clarified. And I do think maybe another conversation somewhere on here is, because Jared and I and Christine noted this, one of the best things that came out of the technical analysis proposal was one of the consultants calling us on our interchangeable use of strategies, pathways, recommendations, and ensuring that we had clear definitions of what we're talking about with all of those and what the level of specificity is for each one. And ICF offered us some suggested definitions, and I can share those around actually as a starting
That might be helpful
to ensure that we all agree.
Can we just agree that at our next meeting, we will look at that nomenclature so that we find ourselves in agreement on. And I just heard a hierarchy, and there's even a fourth level that we could get to. But it will be useful for us to develop a nomenclature that we refer to here. And I do think, by the way, I'm agreeing with the dialogue, Gina, between you and Peter, that what we hope to aim for in June would be something more specific than a pathway and something less specific than a program design. And that word, the word that comes to mind is strategy, but recognizing that strategy doesn't mean program design.
And if I could offer a point of clarification, Christine, I saw you being concerned in my answer around what the consultants are going to provide. They may provide us with some recommendations or some opportunities within a certain strategy, but I don't necessarily see them offering us different strategies. And I could be wrong in that, but that doesn't feel the level. They're not going to, tell us to build a bunch of nuclear power plants, right? They're not going to, that would be a sort of to my mind, outside of the scope of their efforts.
So Peter, I agree with you on that last point, but I would be open to asking the consultants, hey, what aren't we thinking of that you're aware of based on work that you may be doing elsewhere? Right. Oops, we forgot an equipment replacement rebate program altogether. And they might say, hey, you left this thing out. And it's a pretty big item.
That all makes sense.
I'll just add on that, because Jared reminded me also that CADMIS in their proposal has an inventory of existing programs as part of their to-do. So I think that's great that they'll be bringing resources to bear on the inventory. And to respond to Gina's comment, that next point of understanding the effectiveness in reducing greenhouse gases and the cost that we spend on those, that's also part of the technical analysis that will be done. But we don't have to do that.
Yeah, because Gina, as you may have seen in the previous documents, and we can share around, I think Jane may have shared around, one of the first climate council meetings, Heidi Hales from DEC did an overview of existing state programs. There has not been a level of analysis yet to determine that those cost effectiveness pieces is really sort of a here's all the things that we're doing, and some of them kind of factor in together to create change, and some of them are independent. But that's out there, and let me find that and I'll share the link for that for everybody. We just thought after having a conversation that we all talked about getting together to talk about a work plan separately for the smaller group, was the idea of having our group sort of start to do some initial thinking about those so that we can feed some of our thinking into the consultant's work, so that they're not just picking up a blank slate.
Jared, your hand's up. Anybody else on this topic before we move on?
Thanks, Rich. I just, and maybe this is where the agenda and track of conversation is going already, but I would just suggest that it would be helpful in the context of discussing the draft template if we can agree on some of these definitions of terms. As Jane was discussing, I think we've got some good starting points in terms of distinguishing between pathways and strategies and policies. I will just, if it's okay, I'll just share my screen really briefly, because I want to share an example, because it might be helpful context for feedback about how EAN did it for our emissions reduction pathways analysis. So when we talk about pathways, there are these broad buckets. So we talk about transportation pathways as in the way that Peter was talking about: electrification, behavioral measures, efficiency and low carbon fuels; thermal pathways as electrification, weatherization, woods and biofuels. And within those pathways, there are specific measures or actions that you can take. I guess actually we call them methods, sorry. That should say measures, but it will say specific things around heat pumps or biofuels or telecommuting or a number of electric vehicles. But that's just an example of how, I'm not saying that's right, but that's a reference point. And regardless of what we choose, I think we just need to pick terms, define them, and then use them consistently, especially within the template context.
Thanks, Jared. Any more comments on this? Because I do want to get to the template.
Let's take a look at the template, and then we should decide which lucky groups are in the first round and which lucky groups are in the second round of discussions.
Okay, so this is really a first crack, and I'm already as we start to talk about definitions of pathways, strategies, recommendations, is how I've been thinking about it, but I think I need to build this a little differently. But it gives you a flavor of what I think could be a first cut with respect to putting in the work that you've already been doing independently in your task groups. And so here we're thinking about, and then this would be tailored for ag and ecosystems and rural resilience also, which are the three main subcommittees coming up and putting together strategies and recommendations. So let's just recognize perhaps that the beginning, the way I had been thinking about it was that you would have a strategy. And so now I'm and then that strategy could have multiple recommendations that are to get you at implementing that strategy. There's probably also now a single pathway that then has multiple strategies, and then those strategies have multiple recommendations. So I'll think about how to play around with that if this is a useful tool at the beginning. But then this would be a feedback and just walk you through thinking about the key stakeholders, first and foremost, the general description, the key stakeholders, the timeline of implementation, and then thinking about qualitatively how you describe the impacts. And I was thinking just at this level, doing it high, medium, and low. And then Catherine and I talked about how this has been sort of a really useful sort of end column for you to be thinking about other implementation considerations around the barriers or the risks, enabling initiatives that are required, implementation steps. And like one of the ways I think about that pocket is like, if the strategy requires towns to be on board and towns to be the ones to implement it, then I've been thinking about, I have Chris Tampany in the back of my head saying, well, is the capacity there, or what is the barrier for the town to be able to move it forward? So, so again, this is, you know, it's intended to be a simplified version in order to get us to what we need for July. But I'm, you know, recognizing that we're a little bit short on time, I would really love if maybe a suggested pathway here would be a few of us work a little bit on this, especially with specific different task leads and your work in mind, and think about how useful this is for you all, and ensure that we get it out in a timely manner so that you all can be feeding up into it. And I'd love to work with this first and foremost with all of you and get it right for cross-sector, and then take it to the other subcommittees, ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, sort of refining it for their specific use.
Jim, I really appreciate,
volunteers.
oops, sorry, Richard. I think this is a great start, and I do think there's probably some feedback, and it would be useful to see from the other task leads how some of their pieces fit in, and their questions, like Joey just offered, like, is this an expansion of an existing program, which would be helpful to know. I think we can spend some time on this. I certainly would be happy to participate in that smaller group and look at it as well.
Gina?
I would like to be involved in that. And the two things that I see missing here are what are the benefits? You're just talking about the impacts, but
Good point. One quick reaction I have is that, I'm sorry, was there a hand up?
I have a similar table that's helped me. Can you hear me? I created a similar table for my own use. And one thing that's really important, and I don't know how you get at it, is, and I think I said this already, it's the degree of investment necessary to get to the emissions reductions. And we need to demonstrate that here on this table. So it's not just where does the money come from, but here is the money we need to do the job, which in my mind is a huge difference from the way all these climate change plans have been done in the past. We've always said, well, here's the money we can scrape together, but we're turning it on its head. We're saying, here's what we need to do. How do we go find the money? So I'd like to represent that in this evaluation somehow. And that's why I want to help with the table.
Okay,
We
so
won't get that involved.
so far we've got it, Peter, Jane, and Gina.
And I think I saw Jared's hand as well.
Yeah, just to volunteer if I can be helpful during that process as well. I'd be happy to work with you.
All right, that sounds great. I'd only have one comment, which is that presenting it in one giant spreadsheet like this, it seems to me like it's going to get overwhelming, and it will encourage some cryptic comments in each square. I've been through a giant one of these in my own experience, and it might be helpful to take an individual strategy and develop all of the information that we want for that strategy on a single page, and then so that they can be looked at individually, and these different nuances developed individually, as opposed to trying to jam everything into one, what will become a gigantic spreadsheet that will be hard to comprehend.
I think there's a difference between tracking all of them and presenting them and digesting them. And so I think, as Jane suggested, the idea was to get them in one place so that we can look at them all together and have that sense as those of us who are more familiar with all of the different topics might be, but then to break them out individually for presentation and discussion so that it isn't overwhelming, because we know it will be, but having them all together is helpful for sort of as we try to think about whether we're meeting the sort of grand total of need.
I agree with that. I agree that it's useful to assemble them all at some point on a big spreadsheet. I think that crafting them is going to be a lot easier if we have a common format for displaying them. And you can look at each individual strategic recommendation by itself. Obviously, it can also be plugged into a comment frame for being able to add up the columns or whatever, or to compare boxes when doing an overall strategy. I just think it's really hard if we are in the process of evaluating each individual recommendation according to a dozen criteria, it's just going to be hard to have everything in a single spreadsheet to start with, as opposed to combining them at the end. That's my opinion about how I'd like to work.
I have something to offer if it might be helpful. I have a one-page template that we used for an innovative clean energy financing and investment comprehensive study we did for TNC and the CDFI in Maine, that might be an example of the one-page approach that Rich is referring to, that could be adjusted so that the spreadsheet, it's mapping the same qualities as the spreadsheet, but you're able to go deeper on any one major initiative. And I'd be happy to dig that out and send it to Jane for her consideration. If we go with this two-pronged, one sheet per, a little more detail, and then they're summarized and rolled up into one master Excel later.
Okay. I think we've given the time. We're 2 minutes past where we're supposed to be in public comment. I will volunteer the ag and non-energy emissions to go in that first round. Is there anybody other sector that would like to join us at that time?
I hope people don't mind my just making a recommendation. You can resist, but I think the power sector is probably more advanced than the rest of us, than transportation and buildings, and I would think they could go in that first batch too.
Yeah, the only concern I have there, besides Ed, I think not being able to join us, is he and I are both working on June 1st deadlines and unrelated matters, like separately. So I know that it will be a challenge to go in that first slot and do a quality job, as opposed to being in the June slot where we can do better outreach. But I hear you on the actual policy and data behind it. So if we're going to go first, we'll need that understanding.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'm going to be on Burton Island on June 24th. Meh.
So
you guys go
I will
first
flex.
round?
So does that, Joey, are you volunteering for June 10th?
Not yet, Gina.
I'll tell you, I'll be in Wellfleet, Massachusetts on June 24th, where I hear the cell service is terrible. But I could be, we're going to be pressed. Well, not necessarily pressed, if these buckets are giant, to get it done by then.
June
Okay.
10th is what we were
So-
aiming.
June 10th is
So I just heard that you guys, transportation's volunteering for June 10th, and that works well for Liz.
entering more towards.
Preferring that. Okay, so there would be housing and power on the 24th, or buildings and power.
All right, and then the last thing, are there volunteers to do a little bit of a deeper dive to start framing out some of the needs, at least the questions we might ask, and some of the more information we want to dig into around the existing activities inventory?
Peter, I would be happy to. I would just note that as Jane said, I want to make sure that we coordinate that with the planned integration of that in task 4 by our technical consultants.
Yeah, the goal wasn't to do the work, it was to frame it up because they're gonna have lots of questions. And so maybe maybe it's more about being a liaison to that consultant team from this group to help with that process.
I'd be happy to.
Anybody else want to help Jared? I'm sure that's probably an opportunity where we can assign some state staff to support that effort too. Great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. That was productive organizing. We're once again at that point in our meeting when we'd like to hear from members of the public with comments, especially on the second half of today's meeting. And once again, I apologize, I can't see all the hands. So perhaps Peter, you can, or Jane, you can.
So I see George Gross has his hand up, but I think that's from before. I'm not sure.
That's been up all along, yeah. Anybody else? Okay. I'm taking a deep breath, having looked at the schedule and the proposed template and the public engagement strategy ambitions of this group. But I think we're ready to adjourn. I just want to thank everybody and thanks for all the great comments and the volunteering, and look forward to bearing down on our strategies and also listening hard for input from the public. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thank you all.
Great, we're adjourned.
Thanks all.